She rescued a wounded Comanche from a posse. The next morning, his warriors surrounded her cabin and the wind was restless at evening, rustling the dry grass in whispers and carrying the faint scent of ash and iron. It spoke to Clara June like it always had, murmuring to the cottonwoods behind her cabin, trailing its fingers along the window panes as if it remembered something about her that the world had forgotten. She stood at the edge of her porch, hands folded beneath her shawl, watching the prairie surrender to dusk. The fields stretched like old parchment stained with gold, and beyond them, the horizon bled pink, then bruised purple. In the silence, a lonesome crow circled once above the hills and vanished, its wings slicing to the falling light. Clara didn't speak much these days, and the prairie didn't ask her to. Since the fever took her child and the winter after took her husband, she had lived at the edge of things, edge of town, edge of talk, edge of hope. The cabin was plain, its roof patched with bark and rope, but inside it was neat and quiet and hers. The townsfolk called her strange in the way people do when they mean brave, but are too bitter to say so. They avoided her when they could and pitied her when they couldn't, though none of them ever knocked when they were sick or bleeding. She'd treated a sheriff's broken wrist once, a cowhand's infected boot blister, a child's fever that the preacher said was punishment, but the willow bark cured just the same. She had no kin left, just the earth and her herbs and a life carved in stillness. Then came the hoofbeats. They reached her not as thunder, but as an uneven drumming, like a heart trying to outrun its own ending. Clara lifted her eyes toward the west where the sun had already fallen behind the ridgeline. Dust rose like smoke against the sky, and in it a lone rider broke through, slumped low, one hand clutching the reins, the other limp at his side. He veered toward her cabin, as if drawn not by sight but instinct. The horse staggered, sweat-lathered and wild-eyed, and before she could call out, the rider toppled forward and fell hard into the dust. She ran. He lay half-curled, his chest barely rising, his sides soaked in blood, so dark it glistened like oil in the dying light. A young man, no older than 30, though his face bore the lines of someone who had survived too many winters. A single glance told her what the red band across his brow and the silver-capped braids meant. Comanche. Her breath caught. She looked toward the road. If he had come from that way, others would be following, riders with guns, perhaps a posse. He groaned low as she knelt beside him. The wound was in his side, clean shot, high enough to miss a gut, but close enough to kill if left untended. His skin was burning with fever, sweat beading along his brow. She hesitated, not because he was Comanche, because she knew what it would cost to help him. Still, her hands moved, the way they always had. She dragged him, straining, breathless, across the dirt and into her home. She laid him on the cot near the fire and cut the leather from his side. The bullet hadn't passed through. She boiled her tools, whispered steadying words she did not believe, and stitched him closed by lamplight as the wind clawed at the eaves. He did not wake. By the time she had wrapped his wound and tucked a warm rag beneath his neck, the sound came again. Hoofbeats. Closer this time. 5, maybe 6 horses. Heavy boots, hard voices. She blew out the lamp. They arrived like storm clouds, sheriff's men, all grit and sweat, rifles across their backs. She stepped outside before they could knock, pulling her shawl tighter. Her face was calm, unreadable. They asked if she'd seen a Comanche pass this way. Said he was dangerous. Said he'd stolen a horse, and maybe worse. She told him she'd seen nothing but the wind and a blackbird since morning. The sheriff's deputy squinted at her porch, at the track marks in the dust, the extra saddle print. Her hands didn't tremble. They hadn't in years. Eventually, they left, muttering about the witch in the hills and spitting tobacco near her well. She watched them ride away without blinking. When the sound of their horses faded into the dark, she stepped back inside. The fire had burned low. The young man was still breathing, faint but steady. She brought a basin of cool water and began to clean the blood from his skin, gently as a mother might. His arm flinched when she pressed the cloth to his ribs, and then, slowly, his eyes opened. They were not full of panic nor threat. They were dark, like the stormed earth, and old in a way that went beyond years. He didn't speak, just watched her, as if unsure she was real. She didn't speak either. Language felt unnecessary, almost crude, under the hush of firelight. His gaze drifted to the bowl, then to the herbs drying by the window, the soft quilt she had sewn from worn-out shirts and memory. She moved to the stove and poured him a cup of bone broth, not asking whether he could drink, just placing it near his hand. When she returned to her chair, he hadn't taken it yet, but his eyes had followed her, and there was no suspicion in them, only silence, a silence that felt like recognition. Outside, the prairie creaked under the weight of the stars. Somewhere a coyote called. Clara closed her eyes, exhausted, but a strange peace settled in her chest. He was still alive. That was enough for tonight. She did not know what his name was, or what war he carried on his back, or if he would survive the coming dawn. She only knew that when she found him, something unspoken passed between them, something older than law and gentler than blood. The wind had brought him to her porch. She did not know yet that it would never bring him back. The days that followed were stitched together like an old patchwork, rough in places, tender in others, but holding. The wounded man slept much of the first day, fevered and half lost of pain. Clara sat beside him, changing his bandages and pressing cool cloths to his brow as the late spring sun drifted slow and golden through her cabin windows. She moved through the hours in silence, her hands steady, her thoughts turning not to questions, but to quiet offerings. Food at his bedside, water warmed by the fire, a freshly scrubbed floor beneath his cot. By the second morning, he stirred with more awareness, his body still heavy, but his eyes sharper. He drank the broth she made without protest, and when she offered him a few words, soft, slow, he answered with a nod. His voice came later, hoarse and unused, but was there, strong, measured. Tehina, that was his name. He told her only what was necessary, that he had been alone, crossing through land as people no longer called theirs, that a man's horse had gone missing from the outskirts of town, and the sheriff's posse had found him nearby, on foot, that they had not asked him anything before they raised their rifles. He did not speak with bitterness, just truth. His words were lean, like someone who'd learned not to waste them. Clara didn't press. She had lived long enough to know when silence was a kindness, and when a question was a wound. She let him speak on his own time, let his presence settle like a stone in water, changing the shape of things slowly, without sound. Each morning, he rose from the cot for a little longer. He helped mend her fence, one arm still wrapped in cloth, moving with a patience that felt more like prayer than labor. She watched on the porch as he repaired what winter had broken, his fingers tracing the wood with a craftsman's care. He never asked to stay, but he never asked to leave, either. The town, meanwhile, had begun to stir with suspicion. Sheriff Peyton rode up on the fourth day. He wore a fine vest and a badge he polished too often. He leaned too close when he spoke and smiled like someone used to getting what he wanted. Clara met him with a flat expression and a hand still dusted with flour. He asked about her chickens, her stores for the summer, the state of her health. He did not mention the Comanche, but his eyes did. She answered with short sentences and long pauses, offering nothing but the truth in its most harmless shape. The sheriff lingered anyway, eyes scanning the open door behind her, ears straining for any sound from within. But Tehina was quiet as stone in the far room, and Clara's stillness was a wall the man could not scale. When he left, he did not thank her for the tea she never offered. That night, Tehina carved something while she worked beside the fire. A small figure from driftwood, unfinished, rough around the edges. She noticed his hands moving in rhythm, not hurried, not idle. When she glanced at him, he looked up, and something passed between them. Not a smile. Not yet. But something softened in the space between silence and trust. She asked him then, at last, where he was going once he could ride. He looked to the hearth, where the embers glowed faint and orange, and said only north. The hills beyond the ridge began to carry smoke in the mornings. At first it was faint, just a shimmer above the treetops, like mist. But Clara knew the difference between campfire smoke and summer haze. Someone was watching, waiting. Tehina noticed it too. He didn't speak of it, but his eyes lingered on the horizon longer than before. When he walked the ridge, He did so with the way of a man who listened for more than birds. Clara felt it too, the shifting. In town, whispers began to spread, thin and fast, like prairie fire. The preacher's wife crossed the street to avoid her. The butcher overcharged her for grain. A boy spat near her boots, and his father said nothing. Still, she returned home each day with her head high, her spine straight. Inside her cabin, the air was warm, the food simple, the company quiet. She'd lived years with nothing but memory for comfort. Now, in the silence between her and Tehina, there was something steadier. Not warmth, not yet, but the sense that if she spoke, someone would listen. One night, she found him sitting beneath the stars. The sky was clear, sharp with starlight, the moon a thin smile overhead. He sat cross-legged in the dirt, face turned upward, his breath misting faint in the cooling air. She brought him a blanket and didn't return inside. They sat side by side for a long time, saying nothing, just breathing the same night. After a while, she asked him if he missed them, his people. He nodded. Then he said something low, almost to the earth itself. I miss the sound of my mother grinding maize before dawn. Clara turned her face away, so he wouldn't see how that sentence reached something in her she had buried with her child. She swallowed and whispered back, I miss the sound of small feet across the floor. There was no comfort in what they said, but there was closeness, another silence, another thread tied between them. By the time she looked up again, a thin smoke had begun to curl along the far ridge. Not distant, not passive. Tehina stood. He spoke softly, but there was gravity in it. They're near. The next morning broke with sunlight too bright for the news it carried. A shadow moved past her window, and when Clara stepped out, they were already there. Warriors, at least 12. Painted faces, steady horses, silent as dawn mist. They surrounded her cabin without a word. Tehina walked past her, barefoot, wrapped in her husband's old coat. He stood in the open, facing them without fear. He spoke in Comanche, voice low and rhythmic, like a river speaking to its banks. She couldn't understand the words, but she understood the weight of them. The tallest rider dismounted, a man with silver woven into his braids and the sharp gaze of a hawk. He walked to her steps and placed a single eagle feather on the porch. Then he turned without a word and rode back. Tehina returned to her side. They will not harm you. You are honored. Clara stared at the feather. Her breath caught in her chest. They call you Sister the Wind, he added after a pause, because you do not cage anything, yet all things rest in your hand. She did not reply. That night, she lit a candle, watched it burn until the wax curled like petals. She felt the weight of something new pressing into her bones. Not danger, not exactly, but transformation, the kind that does not ask permission before entering a life. When she stepped out the next morning, the feather was still there, but so was the sheriff and the posse, 6 riders, hard-faced, eyes sharp with fear and something crueler. They said nothing to her, just stared at the feather, at the footprints, at the dark man behind her door. They left without a word. But Clara knew what silence like that meant. She closed her door softly, as if not to wake something already stirring. In the far distance, smoke rose again from the hills. The wind shifted in the days that followed, coming down from the north in cooler currents that brushed Clara's skin like a breath from some distant world. The hills no longer smoked, but the air held something tighter than fear, expectation, as if the land itself braced for something it could not name. Tehina moved more now. The wound had closed clean, though the scar would speak for months. He walked with less effort, tended the horse with gentle hands, and carved each evening by the window. Little animals this time, fox, rabbit, hawk, shaped from bits of driftwood and whittled with the same care he gave to silence. Clara found herself watching him without meaning to, not for danger, but for proof that he was real, that this quiet man with eyes like river stone and a voice soft as twilight had come into her life not to take something, but to return it. He never spoke of leaving, and she never asked. Instead, the days unfolded with rhythm. She worked the garden while he swept the path. They ate in silence, but shared glances that grew fuller, more knowing. He repaired the porch steps one slow nail at a time, and when she thanked him, he only nodded, as if to say her presence was payment enough. The townsfolk had grown meaner in their quiet. A second visit from Sheriff Peyton came with no questions, only stares. He stepped inside uninvited, eyes combing the shelves and floorboards, boots tracking dust over her clean planks. Tahina wasn't there, but Clara could feel him outside, still and listening. The sheriff said a few things not meant to be direct, words like peacekeeping, like community concern. He mentioned horses gone missing north of the river and fires seen near the ridge. He touched her tea kettle like it was his. Clara didn't flinch, didn't argue. She looked at him with the same calm she wore when burying things. Words, grief, fear. He left without a charge. But he looked back twice. That night, Clara found Tahina by the oak tree behind the house, sitting cross-legged in the last spill of dusk. He held a branch in one hand, carving slowly, shaving curls that fell like feathers to dirt. She sat beside him, letting her skirt spread like spilled cream in the grass. He placed the carving in her hand. It was a horse, not smooth or polished, but alive in form, head lifted, mane caught mid-motion, as if carved from breath rather than wood. She turned it in her palm, unsure what to say. He said it for her. "You are wind." The sentence felt strange in her ears. He clarified, "Not wild wind, the kind that shapes dunes, the kind that finds what's lost." She looked at him, and for the first time in years let her guard slip. "You don't know what I've lost." He met her eyes, unflinching. "I know you carried it long enough to become its shape." Silence followed, but it didn't stretch painfully. It hummed like a string between them. Familiar. True. He added softly, "My people saw what you did. They call you Tso Tava, Sister of the Wind." The name struck something inside her she hadn't known was waiting. Not just a title, but a recognition. A name not built from loss, but from what she chose in spite of it. That evening, as a chill settled over the prairie, she invited him in before he could sleep beneath the stars again. He followed quietly, the space between them narrowing with each step. By the hearth, she poured him warm cider. When their fingers brushed, something sparked, not desire, but gentleness so deep it hurt. He asked about the child only once. She told him her name was Maggie, that she liked to braid weeds and feed bluebirds from her palm, that the fever came one night and took her before morning, and with her went the light. He didn't offer words of comfort, just his presence, his stillness. He said, "My brother was younger. He died in a storm. I still talk to him when the thunder walks." Clara closed her eyes. "Sometimes I think I still hear her laugh. In the kettle, in the birds. Sometimes it makes me angry." He nodded. "Sometimes love stays behind like a ghost in the shape of sound." They didn't touch. Not then. Not yet. But when he slept, it was in the chair beside her hearth. And when she rose in the morning, he had already fed the chickens and repaired the broken latch on the cellar door. It should have been enough. The quiet, the peace, the slow healing. But the town was a place that measured right and wrong by the shape of a man's skin. Word spread faster than fire. Whispers sharpened into warnings, and those warnings sharpened into cruelty. On a cold morning, Clara found her garden torn through, herbs scattered, a jar of honey smashed. A crude sign nailed to her fence. "White blood don't mix with savage." She burned it without a word. That night, Tahina handed her another carving. This one was not a horse, nor animal. It was her. Not exact, but the shape of her. A woman standing tall, a braid down her back, arms extended not in fear, but in welcome. Her hands shook as she held it. "Why do you see me this way?" "Because you are not afraid to choose what is right, even when it costs you." "And why do you stay?" "Because I remember how it feels to belong nowhere, and I see the same look in your eyes." The wind outside stirred like breath. She leaned forward, not rushed, not desperate, just close enough to let her forehead rest gently against his. They stayed like that for a long time. When morning came, it carried smoke. Not on the hills this time, but from her own roof. She woke coughing. Flames clawed at the corner of her cabin, rising from where someone had spilled oil and sparked it with hate. She and Tahina beat the fire back together, hands raw, eyes stinging, lungs full of ash. They saved the walls. The rest, the porch, the stores, the cot, was gone. And so was the horse. The one he'd been mending for days. The one that had come lame and left in panic. Clara stood in the ruin, barefoot on scorched earth, heart pounding in a way it hadn't since the day she buried her child. Tahina found her hours later, sitting on the last unburned step, staring at the place where the wind had once brought him. He knelt beside her. "I will go." She shook her head, though the tears came freely now. "They'll come again," she whispered. "They'll burn what's left. With you here. Without you." He looked toward the ridge, toward where his people waited. "Then I will ask them to let me return for you." She met his gaze, something harder now beneath the grief. "No, you don't leave me behind. Not again." But she could already see it in his eyes. He was gone before the second dawn. Not taken. Just gone. And the wind, when it came that morning, did not carry ash. It carried a quiet promise she couldn't yet name. The world was still black when Clara opened her eyes. Not with fear. Not even from restlessness. Something had shifted. A breath had been held too long and released. She sat up slowly, the burned edges of her home curled in deeper shadow. Ash still clung to her skirts from days before. Smoke had sunk into the wood and into her skin. The cabin, though wounded, stood, a roof patched with canvas, windows bare, most of her jars gone, her shelves scorched. But the hearth had survived. The carved horse had survived, and she had survived. She moved through the dark with purpose, gathering what could be carried. Her hands didn't tremble, not even when they passed over Maggie's old shawl, folded beneath the floorboards. She placed it into a sack with a worn book of prairie herbs and a single wooden carving, her likeness, carved by hands that had held grief without flinching. Outside, the wind murmured again. She had come to know its voices, how it rose before a storm, how it carried crows when something died, how it warned a change in a way no preacher ever could. She had no horse, but she walked anyway, toward the ridge. The soil gave beneath her steps, soft from a recent rain. The stars hung overhead, faint now, paling as the sky began to turn. Blue melted into gray and then, slowly, into the blush of a coming sun. She found them beyond a river, where the hills began to curve like sleeping giants. They had made camp in the crook of a red rock bluff. No fires, no voices, just movement, swift practice, sure. Tahina stood at the edge, his back to her. His long shadow stretched across the morning grass, like a memory not yet claimed. When he turned, something in his eyes broke. Not surprise, not sorrow, just the full weight of what love becomes when it's no longer hidden. She walked up to him without a word. Behind him, the other warriors watched, silent, solemn. Among them, an elder woman wrapped in turquoise and deer hide stepped forward. Her eyes were lined with age but sharp as flint. She studied Clara the way rivers study stone. Clara bowed her head, not from submission, but from understanding. The woman spoke in a language Clara didn't know, but the cadence was clear. She is alone, the words might have said, but she is not empty. Tahina looked to the matriarch, then to Clara. They want to ride north, to safety, far from the law's reach. And you? I told them I would not leave you behind. She waited, but they do not welcome outsiders lightly, he continued, not even those who save us. Clara stepped closer. Her voice did not waver. I don't need to belong to be loyal. I don't need to be accepted to ride beside you. I only need to know you'll ride with me, not away from me. The matriarch approached then. She held out a bundle, wrapped in buffalo hide, tied with blue thread. Clara took it. Inside was a shawl the color of dusk, sewn with symbols she didn't recognize. The woman placed a hand on Clara's shoulder, then turned away. Tahina smiled. That means yes. They moved swiftly after that, gathering supplies, loading horses. The quiet before departure was holy, almost mournful. The kind of hush that only comes when something old is ending and something new waits without promise. But it didn't wait long. Gunshots cracked the morning like thunder. Men came down the hill. 7, maybe more, sheriff's posse, rifles raised, eyes hard with something uglier than duty. Their coats were dusted with trail, but their hearts were heavier. Sheriff Peyton rode at the front, mouth set like a trap, eyes locked on Clara. "I should have known," he called out, his voice slicing the early light. "Should have known you'd crawl back into their arms. You lied to me. You hid him." Clara stepped forward. "I helped a man. That isn't a lie. That's mercy." He pointed his gun. "That man's wanted." "Then take me too," she said, stepping closer. The sheriff's lip curled. "Don't test me, girl. Not when you burned every bridge in that town." Tahina came to her side, slow and calm, his body a wall beside hers. "This isn't your fight," the sheriff snarled. "This land don't belong to your kind." Tahina didn't reach for a weapon. He only spoke one sentence. "She belongs to herself. And that is more than you can say." For a moment, everything was still. A hawk screamed overhead, circling. The air was dry and sharp. Then a single rider, one of the posse, lowered his gun. A young man, barely more than a boy. His eyes didn't carry hate, just confusion. He looked at Clara, then at the warriors behind her, and he turned his horse around. Another followed. The sheriff shouted, cursed, but the men didn't stop. Only 3 remained, and their faces had already begun to fold. "You've lost," Clara said quietly. "You think he'll protect you?" "No," she answered. "I've already protected myself." Sheriff Peyton's horse shifted beneath him, sensing the break. He spit once in the dust, turned his gaze to Tahina, then Clara again. But the fight had gone out of him, not from fear, from being seen without the power to unsee himself. He rode off last. The wind was silent again. Tahina turned to Clara, and for the first time let his shoulders fall. She placed a hand on his chest. "I don't want to be saved. I want to choose." "Then choose now." "I already did." They rode before the sun, cleared the ridge. North, through valleys what would do, through grasslands that hadn't yet known grief. Her horse was borrowed, her past buried, but the road ahead was stitched with a kind of music she'd forgotten. Somewhere behind them, the cabin would fall to ruin. The townsfolk would twist the story, polish their guilt with lies. But no one could erase the truth from the hills. The place where a woman stood in the ashes and said no more. Clara did not look back. Not because there was nothing to return to, but because there was everything to ride toward. And the wind, steady now, carried no fear, only her name, in a tongue she was still learning to understand. Sister the Wind. And so she was. If this story stirred your soul, don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell. More Wild West tales await you.